Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to our session on social and emotional well-being in middle school years. We're really excited to be presenting on this topic to all of you. And in the spirit of thinking about our own middle school experiences, as I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about my life as a middle schooler and remembering one day when I was in middle school when my mother came home from seeing a friend and she brought a book with her, and the cover of the book had a picture of a teenage girl who was yelling clearly at a parent or another adult, and the title of the book was "Get Out of My Life, but First Can You Drive Me to the Mall?" And besides being mortified that my mother walked around for months, it seemed, carrying this book everywhere we went, I thought that it exemplified this tension that we were talking about earlier this morning of middle schoolers wanting and needing so much to develop independence, and at the same time really needing adults in their life too for both the logistical support of drives to the mall, but also emotional support and other forms of caring and support. And I was thinking about how that can be particularly complex in the context where we're concerned about our young people's social and emotional well-being. And we'll be talking in this panel about bullying and about mental health. And I was thinking about how tricky it can be to figure out as adults if we intervene, when we intervene, how we intervene in ways that feel helpful, supportive, and effective for middle schoolers. So I'm really excited to present this panel that we've put together for you here today. We have an opportunity here to be thinking about convergence across multiple schools around Boston University around this research topic of social emotional well-being among students. My colleague Melissa Holt unfortunately can't be here because she had to travel unexpectedly. The first presentation will be by Dr. Katie Parodi. Dr. Parodi is a graduate of our own BU Wheelock doctoral program. She's currently a part-time instructor here at BU Wheelock, and she'll start this fall as a clinical assistant professor at Sargent College of Health and Rehabilitative Sciences. Congratulations. And her research examines youth mental health and modifiable contextual factors contributing to the health and well-being of sexual and gender diverse youth, and she'll be presenting on bullying. I'm going to then do a presentation on mental health. My name is Jennifer Greif-Green. I'm a faculty member here in the special education program at Wheelock. And then we have two additional faculty from across campus who are going to come and discuss how our research on bullying and mental health relates to policy and practice implications. So we'll hear from Dr. Ziming Xuan, who's a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences and the Department of Epidemiology at the BU School of Public Health. He's a faculty member in the Primary Care Academic Fellowship Program and the Transformative Training Program in Addiction Science and the Injury Prevention Center, as well as a member of the Health Equity Accelerator at Boston Medical Center. He is a social epidemiologist who studies social contextual determinants and especially policy determinants of health, and particularly among vulnerable populations. And then we'll also hear from Dr. Donna Pincus. Dr. Pincus is the director of the Child and Adolescent Fear and Anxiety Treatment Program at the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, or CARD, and is the CAS Feld Family Professor of Teaching Excellence at Boston University. Her research focuses on the assessment and treatment of children's fears and anxieties and the development of new treatments for children and adolescents with anxiety disorders, particularly in community settings, including in schools. So we're hoping to present some new information for you today, to help to raise some new questions for you, and again to show how from our different perspectives we can be thinking about the social emotional experiences and challenges of middle school students. So I'm going to turn over the mic now to Dr. Parodi, soon to be Professor Parodi. If you're interested in learning more about our work here at BU Wheelock, Dr. Holt and I share a research lab, the Social Adjustment and Bullying Prevention Lab, and I put up some links to some of our websites here, which have information on our work related to bullying, to school mental health, to the project that Dr. Parodi will be describing, the Peer Experiences Project, and our research on gender diverse youth as part of Project Avant.
Hello. It's a real honor to be here today, especially to be back at BU Wheelock, a place that holds a very special place in my heart. As Dr. Green noted, my name is Katie Parodi. I come as a researcher. I am clinically trained in evidence-based interventions for children, youth, and families. And I'm also the parent of a middle school student. So this is a topic that I come deeply invested in today, and grateful to share with you all. So today I'm going to speak about bullying in the middle school years, focusing on what it is, how common it is, and the impact on young people. I will also talk about a specific form of bullying known as bias-based bullying, and then turn to what we can do in our respective roles in the community to prevent bullying. And so I want to situate this in a developmental perspective. We're here today to talk about the middle school years, 6th to 8th grade approximately in the United States. What we know about this critical period of development is that peers become increasingly important to early adolescence. And this can be very powerful for young people, as we know from research that having a strong bond with one's peers is linked with psychological well-being, right? So that's really critical. Group identity and peer acceptance become central during these years, and relationships with one's peers become increasingly sophisticated. We also know that this is a critical time in which rejection, social exclusion can increase among young people, and also that experiences of peer victimization, including bullying, increases. So what is bullying? So in the context of schools, it has been defined as a damaging social process that is characterized by an imbalance of power driven by social, societal, and institutional norms. It is often repeated and manifests as unwanted interpersonal behavior among students or school personnel that causes physical, social, and emotional harm to the targeted individuals or groups and the wider school community. I also want to note that one of the pioneers of research on bullying, Dr. Donna Pincus, emphasized that bullying has 3 core elements. So first, it is repeated over time, or it has the potential to be repeated over time. Second, that it is intentional. And third, that the unwanted aggressive behaviors occur in the context of a power imbalance. So what is that? By power imbalance, it can be anything from a student being more popular to being physically stronger than another student, to a student having more money, as well as age differences between students. So for instance, one student is older than the other student. We also know that bullying among kids and youth can take many different forms. Direct forms include physical bullying, right? So such as punching or shoving another student. It can include verbal bullying, making threats, as well as making sexual jokes and gestures. Indirect forms include spreading rumors or gossip, as well as intentionally excluding a peer, right? So this social exclusion. And additional forms include property theft or damage, as well as cyberbullying, which occurs online, such as through social media platforms, messaging applications, as well as through cell phones. Importantly, research suggests that youth tend to experience not just one form of bullying, but rather multiple forms of bullying that you see here. In terms of prevalence, what do we know, right? How common is it? Bullying is unfortunately quite common among youth. Approximately 30% of youth are involved in bullying, whether as an aggressor, a target, or as both an aggressor and a target, as you can see in the slide here. Importantly, significant disparities exist, right? So some groups of young people are at heightened risk for being bullied compared to others. With respect to racial and ethnic identity, multiracial youth, as well as American Indian or Alaskan Native youth, are at increased risk compared to white youth. Students with a disability are more likely to be bullied. And youth who identify as gay or lesbian are more likely to be bullied than youth identifying as heterosexual or straight. And there are well-established disparities for transgender and gender diverse youth compared to their cisgender counterparts. There's been robust studies there. Importantly, developmental considerations are key. So bullying typically peaks in early adolescence. So we are seeing it peak during the middle school years. We're here to talk today about the middle school years. So approximately between 6th and 8th grade. And then there tends to be a decline in high school. And so middle school is a really critical period, right? This is such an important period for early intervention and prevention. You know, we can understand and we can address bullying in our respective roles during this period. And I just think that is so key, and I just want to underscore that. So studies that have looked at how the prevalence of bullying is changing over time, right? These are like the temporal trend studies, have shown a small decline in peer victimization worldwide prior to the onset of the global COVID-19 pandemic. With respect to cyberbullying specifically, nationally representative data from the United States, so this is the YRBS, a really important public data source, indicated that the prevalence of cyberbullying stayed flat between 2013 and 2023, though another study found an increase in online harassment rates. And doctors Holt and Green collaborated on a study published recently in 2022 examining whether the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted bullying and cyberbullying rates. This study found that both school bullying, so this is in-person bullying, the face-to-face one, and cyberbullying rates declined. Some of the reasons that school bullying declined during the pandemic may be due to reduced in-person social contact that occurred as a result of the pandemic. You might remember, the pivot to remote instruction. But the surprising finding here was that during a time of this increased online use by students was that cyberbullying rates also declined. In terms of the impact of bullying on young people, it can take a substantial toll. Bullying victimization has been consistently linked with adverse psychological functioning, right? So these are mental health problems, including anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation and behaviors. It also impacts educational outcomes, right? This is like the academic functioning, with bullying exposure linked to a lower sense of school belonging, lower school grades, and attendance, so things such as skipping class or school. Bullying involvement has also been linked with sexual risk-taking behaviors, somatic or physical complaints, use of substances, other victimization exposures, and later aggression. Bias-based bullying, you may also hear this referred to as bias-based harassment or as identity-based bullying or stigma-based bullying, is a specific form of bullying related to actual or perceived identity characteristics. These include, but are not limited to, one's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, disability status, immigration status, These can include racial slurs, homophobic name-calling, and socially excluding an individual with a disability, for example. So how common is bias-based bullying? So research tells us that nearly 1 of every 5 youth report experiencing bias-based bullying. And this is due to a multitude of identity characteristics reported by young people. And you can see here, this includes gender, race, and sexual orientation. Additionally, 1 out of every 10 youth indicated bias-based harassment was due to 2 or more social identities. Additionally, in a recent study, over 1/2 of students who reported peer victimization stated it was due to their identity characteristics specifically. And in a separate study focused on high school students, so just a little bit older, just over 1/4 of students reported identity-based bullying perpetration, right? So they're the actor. So notably, a small but growing body of research shows that bias-based bullying is linked with worse outcomes for young people than general bullying victimization, right? And by that general bullying victimization, I mean the non-bias-based form. Exposure to bias-based bullying victimization is linked with mental health problems such as depression. It's been linked with substance use, decreased school grades, and educational aspirations for young people, as well as school avoidance and absenteeism. For those young people who are involved in bias-based bullying as an aggressor, they're at heightened risk for exposure to violence, right? We need to be thinking about all young people as part of this. Importantly, youth with multiple socially marginalized identities have the highest rates of experiencing and perpetrating identity-based harassment. And in turn, this is related to high rates of mental health problems, negative overall health and well-being, and violence involvement. And so this is some research from our recent paper that just came out, which examines predictors of bias-based bullying victimization. So as noted, bias-based bullying, it's an especially adverse form of interpersonal victimization that targets one's actual or perceived identity characteristics. In this study, we examined multiple predictors from the individual, the family, the school, and the community or societal level of the social ecology. So we could ideally understand where to intervene, right? Like, where are we targeting our prevention and intervention efforts? I just think this is so crucial. And what I just want to highlight here is just a few key findings from this study. So this included that sexual minority youth had higher initial scores of bias-based bullying victimization compared to their straight or heterosexual counterparts. Right, so what this means is that they're experiencing more bias-based bullying. But promisingly, so this was a longitudinal study, we had 4 waves of data, we found that on average, they were decreasing at a significantly more rapid rate compared to straight or heterosexual youth over the study period. And I always say it's important to find promising findings so you can leverage that and do something. And then in terms of those key protective factors, right, we entered all those predictors. School climate emerged as a critical protective factor when considering all the factors in one model, right? Like, what is the strongest predictor? It was school climate, and this to me is so exciting because it is potentially the most modifiable, right? We can do something in our respective roles. We also found that peer support, family support, And living in a state with enumerated anti-bullying laws, right, so those protections for students, was linked with those initial scores of bias-based bullying, right? These are conferring protection for young people. And as my colleague, Dr. Ziming Xuan, will talk about more of those anti-bullying laws after. And so I want to wrap this up with, like, what can we do? And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, medicine. The saying in prevention is an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So what does prevention look like with respect to bullying? How do we stop bullying before it occurs? How do we mitigate the impact of bullying among young people? So for me, I'm trained in a prevention science and practice lens, and that's how I come. I really believe in prevention science. So if we think about this apple approach to preventing bullying, we can put in place effective, evidence-based strategies that cut across key contexts of young people's lives, right? So I'm talking about schools, the home, the community. Think of a young person doing extracurriculars. It might be athletics, it might be music, right? But we have to think about those different contexts. So I just want to highlight some key strategies here. First is amplify education and awareness about bullying. I think about this through a whole school approach, for instance. So educating students about what bullying is and the impact of bullying, as we've discussed here today. Educating teachers and school staff, right? That whole school buy-in. And involving parents and caregivers, for example, through after-school forums with a school psychologist, a therapist, for instance. So related to this first point is provide robust professional development for educators and staff. Third, as I noted in our research, school climate is key. So really promoting a positive school climate, right? Like, what does that look like if you're in schools? What does that look like in your school? So having students feel a sense of belonging at school, that they have at least one adult that they can talk to at school, right? Who is that one adult for you? Can you name one? And finding out the students who don't have one, right? And like trying to connect them to one adult can really make a difference. Promoting a culture of kindness and mutual respect in the school environment, I think, is really crucial. As well as sharing information about anti-bullying policies and effectively implementing those, right? So they are consistently followed through for students. Fourth, I want to highlight, so I'm trained in counseling psychology, so I want to highlight listening to young people. And this is, I think relationships matter so much. And so part of this is just having those conversations with young people. And these don't have to be solely focused on bullying. Certainly they can if that's what students bring to you. What does bullying mean to you? What does that look like? But these can just be general open-ended questions, right? It's the foundation is the relationship. And lastly, for me, I got into this work because I think young people are at the forefront of social justice and social change, and they are so deeply inspiring to me. I find my hope in young people. And so I want to leave this with empowering students. Empowering students to engage in positive bystander behaviors. I think bystander intervention, we know from the research, is critical. But supporting students in speaking up to address bullying, reinforcing the message to them that actions matter, their actions matter. And also, sharing with students who they can talk to when they witness bullying. Whether that's educators, school leadership, parents and caregivers, a sports coach, a trusted adult. Again, who is that trusted adult for this young person? And so the key takeaway here is that we need the whole community. We need all of you. We need all of us working together to buy into preventing and reducing the impact of bullying in schools. So I just want to say my deep gratitude, and I'm going to pass it now to Dr. Jen Green. Thank you.
Okay, so shifting into mental health, and we heard from Dr. Williams this morning that mental health is on the minds of many of our middle schoolers and also many adults when we think about teenagers. And much of this context for middle school that's relevant to mental health has been discussed already, but to highlight a few of the points here as our students move into middle school, for many of them, it's the first time that they're rotating between classrooms, that they're trying to manage the demands of different teachers and understand how academic classes are different across different adults who they're working with. Many adults in the building are interacting with 100, 150 different adolescents during the course of the day, so there are fewer touch points between students and adults than there are leading up to that point in their educational careers, and greater demand on them both academically and in terms of their organization and academic functioning and executive functioning. And as we've been talking about, greater cognitive flexibility and perspective taking. So whereas some of our elementary students may not be as aware of what's happening around them in the news in their community, and in middle school where students are able to understand the perspectives and understand the events around them, they may be taking those to heart and impacted by them in new and different ways. So when those demands become so significant that they outweigh the internal and external resources that our students have, we'll sometimes see them exhibiting behaviors that will indicate that they're struggling with their mental health. And as psychologists, we typically think about these behaviors as falling into one of two categories, and those are internalizing behaviors, which look like anxiety, depression, withdrawal, or isolation, where students are turning inwards on themselves. And the second category are externalizing behaviors, where students are acting out, and we sometimes see them engaged in aggression, irritability, oppositionality to adults. And these are signs to us that students are struggling to manage the demands that are coming at them from the world around them, and need support in terms of establishing internal resources and external resources to manage those demands. A little bit of context about mental health more generally. Globally, we know that about half of adults by the age of 75 will experience mental health challenges that align with a diagnosable disorder. Most of these develop in childhood or in early adolescence, and we know that of all the different types of mental health challenges that people develop, anxiety is the most common and also develops the earliest in development. And I'm showing a graph with age of onset curves that show at what age people tend to first experience anxiety and behavior problems, which occur earliest in development. And then as youth move through childhood into adolescence, we see an uptick in depression and mood disorders and in substance use disorders. Of course, these have an impact on school functioning and well-being. We know from many studies that youth who are struggling with their mental health are less likely to graduate on time from school. They have lower educational attainment, so they're less likely to graduate from high school and to enter into post-secondary educational experiences. They have lower achievement scores on tests. It's hard to focus on a test that you're taking in school when you're feeling anxious or feeling depressed. And they're more likely to be absent from school. And so our research team is sometimes called in by school districts to conduct needs assessments on the mental health of students in schools, and we always assess both the mental health of students and also their school functioning. And inevitably, we're able to show that the same students who are struggling with their mental health are the students who are coming in late to school, missing classes, more likely to be suspended, feeling like they don't understand what's happening in class, more likely to say that they're failing in class. So we really try to make the case to teachers and to school leaders that these are often not different students. The same students who are struggling with their mental health are the students who are struggling academically, and we can't think of these as two separate things or separate kids. We need to be thinking about this work as something that we're doing holistically in the building. Some trends in mental health. particularly during the pandemic. We know that rates of anxiety and depression were increasing among youth even prior to the pandemic. Dr. Parodi has done some work in this area, and we have a chapter that's coming out that Ruchi Khanna, who's here, is a part of writing. So we know that these were on the rise prior to the pandemic, and then there was a sharp increase in anxiety and depression during the pandemic among youth. We also know that most young people in the United States who receive mental health services receive them in the context of their schools. And when schools shut down during the pandemic, there was a decrease in outpatient mental health services. That's also true in the community. There was a decrease in access to outpatient mental health services. And there was an increase in use of psychiatric emergency room services. So without getting the outpatient services earlier on, and when problems are starting to arise, we're more likely to see youth going into crisis and entering into the emergency department to receive mental health care, which is not the optimal place, of course, for youth to be receiving mental health services. Good news, as Dr. Parodi was highlighting, is that we know during the pandemic, even when youth were not present in schools, that the students who felt most connected to schools and to the adults in the schools were doing the best, and that is true outside of the pandemic as well. We know that when youth feel connected to the adults around them and to their school community and feel a sense of belonging, that their mental health is better. I'm currently working with a colleague at the University of Florida, Dr. Joni Splett, on developing an ed research brief that will be published through the Annenberg Institute at Brown. They put together these ed research briefs to communicate issues related to schooling, and we're putting together school strategies relating to supporting student mental health. So these are school-wide strategies, and I'm going to read them all to you, but I'm just going to highlight two of them today. So the first is locating mental health services in schools. The second is building partnerships with community providers. The third is providing a continuum of services. Fourth is using universal screenings, and fifth is leveraging existing staff and resources. And all five of these strategies have research support as evidence-based and promising strategies for supporting student mental health. But I'm going to highlight two of them. The first one being the importance of locating mental health services in schools and making sure that schools are aware of the importance of fully staffing mental health supports. And I know that this is a topic that's come up as recently as this week in school committee meetings where school leaders are looking at their budget. But it is a really important issue. We know that, again, most of our young people who receive any mental health services receive them in school settings. This graph here is from a report that was put out by the Birch Center, which is at UMass Boston. The Birch Center is a technical assistance center that does a lot of work around promoting and advocating for mental health in schools. And what you'll see in this graph is that vertical line is at the 500 mark. It shows the ratio that is recommended by the National Association of School Psychologists of students per school psychologist. So the National Association of School Psychologists recommends that there's one school psychologist for every 500 students in the school. And if you pull up the Birch report, I screenshotted the school psychologist report here, but they also have up equivalent graphs for school counselors and school social workers. And what you'll notice first is that in all of the districts across Massachusetts, we exceed that limit. So, and this is not just true in Massachusetts, it's nationwide. We have more students than that per school psychologist. And then what this graph does is it breaks down those ratios by the quartile level of economic need of the district. So if you look at the bar at the bottom, that's the quartile of districts with the highest level of economic need in their communities. And in those districts, the number of students per psychologist is more than double the recommended number. And then if you look up at that top blue bar, of course, you'll see that in the districts that have the lowest economic needs, so our most well-off districts in the state, we're getting much closer to that recommended number. We're still a little bit above it, but we're much closer. So there are dramatic disparities even when you go from one neighborhood, if you go down the street that way versus that way, you're going to see dramatic differences in the proportion of students per mental health provider in schools. And we know that the mental health providers in schools are providing some of not only the highest quantity of services, but those earlier services to students when they're first starting to show challenges, which can reduce the likelihood of need for crisis intervention services. We also know that when students go to the adults in their building for support, that those adults can access students who don't have access to services in outpatient settings. So I'm part of a research study with the Education Development Center, which runs the Metro West Adolescent Health Survey, which is a survey of health and health risk behaviors in the Metro West area of the state. And we have an article that came out recently and another one that we're working on that's currently under review, where we looked at data from I'm showing you the 2018 Metro West Adolescent Health Survey data, which included a survey of almost 13,000 middle school students. And we looked among those with internalizing symptoms, so symptoms of depression and anxiety and suicidality. And about 30% of those, so you'll notice out of all of those, only 30% said that they had talked to a mental health provider at school. About 30% also talked to a mental health provider outside of school, a little less. So 2 takeaways there. Most of our students who need access to mental health services are not talking to someone, and they're more likely to be talking to someone in Massachusetts, Metro West area, in their school than outside of their school. And we also know that there are significant racial and ethnic disparities in who has access to those services. So in this data set, we saw that white students were significantly more likely to speak with a provider in the community than Black and African American students, but that there was no significant difference in the school setting. So schools have an opportunity to reduce many of the barriers to care that we see in community settings. Those include cost of care, transportation, convenience, timing. Schools have an opportunity to connect with students who are not connecting otherwise. And the second of the strategies that I want to highlight is using universal screenings. So we know that there are unique challenges in the middle school level to the identification and referral process for youth who may benefit from mental health services. In general, children rely on adults to notice that they're struggling and to refer them for mental health services. So we as adults need to first notice that something is going on and then be able to label it or give a name to it, as you were saying earlier, and then know how to refer and effectively connect them to mental health services. As youth enter adolescence and young adulthood, we rely more on self-referrals. So we know that adolescents are increasingly more likely to say, I need to talk to someone, I need some support. But middle school is in that middle ground. Middle schoolers need the support of adults still and also need the strategies and skills to be able to speak out and ask for support themselves, which is a challenging place for them to be. So one of our recommendations is using universal screening. So in addition to having adults watch out for youth, ask youth how they're doing, universal screenings have the opportunity to proactively identify those who may need additional supports. And there are a lot of research-backed tools that are very brief and that are freely available that can be used for this purpose. We recommend using a dual factor approach. And by dual factor, we mean assessing both challenges and strengths. So we don't want to just say that students are not depressed. We don't want just the absence of depression or the absence of anxiety. We want to provide an environment where we're supporting students in feeling connected, feeling like they're thriving, feeling joy in the work that they're doing every day at school. So a dual factor measure doesn't just measure the problems or the absence of those problems, but also measures strengths. And part of the reason that's so important is that every time we give our youth a survey or ask them a question, we're communicating to them what's important to us and what we value. The data we collect communicates to people what our values are, and we want to tell youth and express to youth that we value both helping them to address the challenges they have and also helping them to grow the strengths that they have and their assets. Logistically, schools do not need to screen every student and don't need to screen everyone every year. And one of the research recommendations is to look at key grade levels and transition points for students. And one of those key transition points is, of course, the entry into middle school. And so I added a screenshot here of a book that's called Student Stress at the Transition to Middle School, which is all about mental health screenings as students enter middle school. And one of the things that this particular book does really well is it lays out all of the pieces that you need to conduct a screening. So it's not enough just to collect the data. You need to have a process in place for responding after you collect that data. And that means setting up infrastructure around having people available to review the data as it's coming in, the screening information, responding, checking in on students right away, and then using that data in the longer term to plan ahead for how to support students. So that's a resource you may consider, but collecting data at entry into middle school is a way to sometimes collect baseline data so you can see if over the middle school years someone is okay or feeling okay when they enter, but then is experiencing more challenges as they're moving through middle school. And it's also a way to check in at this transition point that we know is a tricky transition point for many students. So a takeaway here is that we want students to have multiple options for connecting with us, for expressing that they need help and that they need support, and for helping to connect them with that support. No one option is perfect, so we try to put together multiple imperfect options to try to give students many different ways of connecting with us and communicating with us. And that's why I chose to highlight the universal screenings in addition to speaking to adults and connecting with adults in their lives as we're thinking about how to best support students. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Shen, who's going to speak about public health perspectives.
Great. It's really an honor to be here. My name is Ziming Xuan. I'm a faculty in the School of Public Health, which is in the medical campus. We have 3 schools here: School of Public Health, School of Medicine, and the Dental School. And I'm always excited to be in this campus because there are just a lot of youth around here, and staying closer to many colleagues here also make me feel excited about the work we are doing. Why do I choose School of Public Health and choose public health as my career? I feel like it's really important to address social contextual determinant of health. It's not that biomarkers are not important, but I feel like to be able to address modifiable and important social contextual determinants can affect a lot more people. So I actually have a question. I mean, I'm very excited to be invited to this forum, but I do have a few questions for you. The first question is, why bullying? That's the topic I'm talking about. Why do you consider bullying as a public health problem? Why is it a public health problem? Well, if you look at Dan O'Hara's work back in the 70s, mostly it's framed at individuals who have experiencing this imbalanced nature, as Dr. Parodi mentioned, and they tend to be repeated, and they are unwanted and intentional. But why is it public health? So the way I look at it, I draw on my research experience on substance use, like alcohol. If we drink and drive, not only it will harm ourselves, it will also harm pedestrians, passengers, it will damage property. It will have this kind of harms to others impact. So the impact goes above and beyond how it will affect individuals. Smoking is the same, right? Secondhand smoke is not gonna just affect you, but also your family members, friends, and you're gonna have a lifelong impact. Similar to bullying, not only will it affect the victim, but also those who perpetrate bullying, the act itself, and also those who care for them. It will make the school less safe. People then tend to feel unsafe. It will affect their academic performance. It will have a lifelong impact. So the impact in itself affects more than individuals. The second point that I would also highlight is, Dr. Parodi talked about the prevalence of the problem is around 30% among middle school. What is not reported is, do we really know the proportion of those that are not reported? Anyone knows? Anyone knows? Right, because it's not reported, it's hard to tell. And there's some statistics that from the education department. They show about 60% of those of bullying events, they are unreported. So if they are unreported, how do we prevent those? how do we prevent those events? So what we are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. What we need to address in order to shift the population level distribution of this problem need to be taking an approach that I think fundamentally align with what public health is doing. So that gives me sort of like the motivation to study this problem, and I feel very privileged to be able to obtain funding from the Center of Disease and Prevention with collaboration with Dr. Green on this project. So let me talk a little bit about that. Oh, I'm going this way. Yes. So, it reminds me, in the 70s when we are trying to prevent driving fatality, there are different ways that we can intervene, right? We can make the car safer. We can educate the driver what is sort of like the traffic rule. We can make the road safer to drive when it's driving. We can keep all those, infrastructure there. But it takes a lot, and all of this in order to reduce driving fatality. And I think the way we approach bullying should be the same, right? This isn't just about the individuals, right? It also connects the family. The parents need to be involved. The school needs to be involved. The district also needs to be involved, as well as the state. And if a state is taking on these efforts, in coordinated efforts, in my view, it would make a big difference. So it's just the idea that Dr. Parodi talked about. If we can make a school a safe place, the school climate is conducive to, the lower risk of bullying, then students are more likely to enjoy study. So this is a social ecological models that people tend to use, and so I want to highlight it here. It really takes the village, and I'm a father of 3 kids. The middle one, she is a middle schooler, but I've been through, as my older one now in Brooklyn High, and he told me, when he was younger, he experienced bullying. So one of the 3, which is not surprising, right, 30%, but I'm sure like these days when it goes on to cyberbullying, I'm sure you get a lot more. So we really need to think hard about the value of using a public health approach. So this is all like part of the main mission of the study is to be able to document to what extent the state had implemented various aspects of anti-bullying policy at the state level and to what extent they connect the school district to implement those in order to create a safe environment. We have about a quarter of a century of data starting from the very beginning in 1999 in the state of Georgia. Georgia was the first state that implemented anti-bullying policies. And as you can tell, it covers an extensive list of provisions. First, in order to be comprehensive, we need to define what is the purpose of the bullying policy law. And you also need to define when and where it is applied. So the scope of the policy is important. And the specific behaviors that needs to be addressed. And then Dr. Parodi also talked about bias-based bullying, whether or not enumeration of specific groups is important. And she highlighted that, 2 out of 3 bullying involve identity-based bullying. So it's actually important for the state to articulate who they are and what are these perceived identity should be considered the more vulnerable populations that these set of policies are intended to address. And then it goes on and to talk about whether they need to involve the district to develop the policy and then to provide regular review for compliance. And then also goes on to talk about within the district policy, what should be included? Should it include a definition? Should it include some transparency procedures? Written documents require? Should we articulate the consequences when bullying occurs? Because if we want to make it really clear, then it will provide some really good guidance on what needs to be enforced. And whether or not there is communication components to the staff member, to student, and to teacher, whether training is provided. Dr. Green talked about infrastructure that is needed in terms of collecting the data, in terms of providing the services, right? We know there is unmet services, even though, in the highest socioeconomic quintile, there is still unmet needs, whether or not the state should provide the district with this kind of resources to work with the school to provide, counseling and mental health services to both the victim and the bullies. And there is a session about victims' rights to pursue additional legal remedy and whether the policy apply to cyberbullying. And more importantly, whether off-campus location would also be considered when cyberbullying occurs. And so I just want to give a snapshot of what's happening in Massachusetts. But I think one of the important development is whether parents should be engaged. Because when you use a socio-ecological model to guide your thinking, the direct relational protection is coming from the parents. And I think it's really important. In the very beginning, as you can see, a lot of states, they are focusing on the scope of the work, the purpose, and specific behaviors defined, right? As you can see from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. However, there is lots of development that is more recent in terms of whether or not the states enumerated protected groups. In the beginning, no states did that, right? If you look at the fourth row, in the beginning, in 1999. And then as you continue now, there are 29 states that have make it very explicit about what type of identities that these bullyings are specific. And this one will give you a list of, based on what kind of identities that they put forward in the anti-bullying law. It includes sex categories, disability status, race and ethnicity, obesity appearance, religion, and country of origin. And as you can see how the policy stipulation diffuse over time, more and more states are picking up and consider this is important in terms of providing specific protection to these vulnerable groups. So we actually created a website that kind of document at the country level across the states how many components each of the states at each of the given years in the last 25 years, how many components that they have. So if we go to this website, you can see that Massachusetts has 17 out of 19 components, and give you a list of all the components listed. And having policy actually matters. And in this earlier study by Hatzenbuehler in 2015, he looked at a cross-sectional sample of all the states and whether or not having at least one component of the anti-bullying policy and how it's going to affect the odds of reporting bullying and cyberbullying. And indeed, having at least one has a substantial decrease of reporting bullying and cyberbullying compared to those that have none. And the more components you have, the more likely the chance would be reduced. So it's actually quite encouraging, but that study was based on a cross-sectional study of one single year. Currently, we're doing an analysis, taking advantage of this longitudinal policy data to see to what extent it can connect to change of bullying prevalence and cyberbullying prevalence over time that can be attributable to the implementation of this policy. So more is coming. I think that pretty much conclude my talk. But I think in essence, what I'm trying to advocate is, for one, we need to take a public health policy. And I attribute that thinking to a professor that I admire more, actually someone who inspired me to go into the field of public health. His name is Geoffrey Rose. He has passed away a long time ago, about 20 years ago. He used to be a professor emeritus in the London Hygiene and Subtropical Medicine. And back in the 80s, he wrote a seminal paper on sick individuals and sick population. And then 5 years ago, 5 years later, he wrote a book, which is really a foundational book about the prevention strategy. And he has this idea of what he called prevention paradox. And he said that, if you look at population level prevalence of a problem, let's say bullying, the majority of the cases are not necessarily coming from people who are high risk. The majority of the cases are actually people who may represent no risk or low risk or moderate risk, right? Just think of, this could happen to any kids, okay? So in order for us to address what is under the tip of the iceberg, we need to focus on population level tools, particular policies that would be able to shift the risk distribution to a lesser degree, in addition to focusing on the high-risk population, the counseling. So that is his argument. And I think it can apply to many mental health problems in the middle schoolers, in terms of suicidality, in terms of mental health. If we can provide the policy and the infrastructure, we can do a lot more than we could ever imagine. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and it is really wonderful to hear just the different scope and perspectives that each of the speakers have brought today. And I come to you today, I'm Dr. Donna Pincus, and I am a professor here in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. And for the past 25 years, I've also directed the Child and Adolescent Fear and Anxiety Treatment Program, which is at the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, which is right across from Agganis Arena here at BU. And that is a very special place. It's actually one of the very few in the entire country centers that advance research, understanding how to help people who are suffering from problems like anxiety and depression and the other issues that we discussed that many middle schoolers are suffering from today, as well as a place that does clinical treatment for children and families, as well as it's a place that also does training of future clinicians, so to increase children's access and families' access to evidence-based care. So it's a very special place, and we're very lucky and fortunate to have it right here on the BU campus. So I'm going to shift our focus a bit in thinking about what happens when a child is seen or an adolescent is identified in a school setting and it's determined that that child might need additional services. How do you begin to help? How do you try to take someone who maybe is suffering from peer victimization or is actually dealing with some realistic worries at home, or even some worries that are unrealistic worries that are still affecting their functioning? So I'm going to take this from that perspective. And we know that now, for many reasons, from our wonderful keynote speaker this morning, why is now a critical time to talk about mental health? And I think we've seen much evidence for this. We know rising rates of anxiety and depression started way before the COVID pandemic, and we also know lots of other contextual issues have also further exacerbated those concerns. And we know if anybody in this room has ever tried to refer a child, or maybe your own child, who needed help, oftentimes you get, there's a long wait list, or I'm so sorry, we could see them in a few months. And oftentimes that teen or child or adult doesn't need help in a few months. They need help right now. So I really feel very passionate about doing what we can do from all these different angles as it was proposed. What can we do together from our different perspectives to try to help increase evidence-based care for youth? And we know that there's actually lack of access to quality care. So even those kids who do get help, sometimes the help they get is not going to be what we know are gold standard, great evidence-based care. So it's really critical that we develop both from a prevention standpoint as well as from that intervention standpoint. How do we help increase well-being? And I think well-being certainly is working with kids, but as we discuss the many contexts with which kids are growing, in thinking about that for how do you enhance school well-being, how do you enhance caregivers' well-being, every one of these systems are affecting children's well-being as well. And so I do come to you today with actually a very hopeful message in the area of psychology. Even compared to when I first came to BU over 25 years ago, we knew much less back then about what helps. And now we know, after many more clinical trials, we know that in fact, we have reason to be hopeful. There are actually very many non-drug approaches, so you don't have to be on medication, but there are skills-based approaches that can help kids to thrive and help them to overcome fears that maybe are holding them back from developing their interests, developing their peer relationships, developing good connections with family members or teachers, or even interests and activities like getting involved in a sport or being able to stand up in front of people and talk. All the things that require us all to have some bravery. And how do we help kids to develop that, especially when sometimes it feels like the hardest thing to do is to do the thing that we're most afraid of. And I challenge us all to think about one thing that you might have been afraid to do at some point in your life, but then eventually did. Who was it that helped you to get over that? Who, whether you went for some additional help, whether it was someone who was extra encouraging or a skill that you developed. Again, thinking about how can we scaffold and give kids those skills. Not every child will get those skills in private therapy or in sessions, individual therapy, and not all kids need that. Some might find that by giving educators tools, though some of the skills can be taught right there in the school setting. So let me tell you a little bit about our Center for Anxiety. We actually were previously in Albany, actually, in New York, and then came to Boston University in 1996. And we now treat between 200 to 300 kids, adolescents, and adults. So we treat people throughout the lifespan. And no one is turned away for financial reasons. So this is, although in center it doesn't take insurance, there's a sliding scale fee, and people can come in fact, and some might be in a more traditional type of therapy where you think it might last a few months, whereas others may be treated, and this may be surprising, but in just 1 week. We have formats of care where you can come and get what we know is evidence-based care delivered in a shorter time period, because we know that when someone needs help, they may need those tools as soon as possible, as well as a launching point and opportunity to practice. So you may think of therapy as being in a room, maybe with one other person, but some of the therapies that we might do here at BU look very different, where we're getting into the places where kids may be most scared. Some, I've sat with them and gone to a movie theater or gone to standing up in front of a small crowd, giving a talk, or petting a dog when you're afraid of something like that, or getting an injection. All things that you may think of as these are all critical things for part of everyday life, but we're not only talking about it, but we're doing it. And so that's part of what exposure therapy might be. No one is ever put into situations where they may be too afraid to start. We do this in a very gradual approach. And our center really has complementary missions. One is clinical research. How do we develop new and novel opportunities to help kids get better? Evidence-based treatment, as well as training and community outreach. So we are all the time going to public schools, going to actually give assemblies for kids for middle school years, understanding what are some of these feelings that we all share. And we know that anxiety is actually a very natural human emotion. So we don't want to get rid of all of it, but we do want to help kids to actually become more at peace with some of those natural human emotions, and actually to get rid of the parts that really are interfering in our ability to thrive. So I wanted to give you somewhat of a snapshot of the types of problems that youth may be coming in for help with. Everything from worries that you can't get out of your mind to difficulties or worries about separation. If you were a middle schooler and still were feeling extremely clingy, needing mom or caregiver around constantly, that could interfere in your ability to develop friendships, to go to birthdays, to be in sports. We have youth who actually, as the rise of middle school, we see problems like panic disorder, those feelings of rush of symptoms that you might be very frightened about, that we actually can teach kids where those symptoms come from and why we never would want to have to call it a panic attack. Because in fact, there's nothing actually attacking you in a panic attack. It's very much, once we break it down, we see exactly where those symptoms come from. But again, it's helping kids in maybe 8 to 12 sessions if they came in weekly, or sometimes some of these types of problems that kids may come in with, we notice can be treated in a much shorter time span. And when I describe the inspirational stories of kids who now will send us postcards because they're traveling again. They could go abroad because they hadn't had an opportunity before to even deal with the panicky symptoms that would come up and being confined if they were on an airplane, or being able to do things they hadn't done for a long time. And that also includes supporting youth and families, and that might be some parenting groups, understanding what is helpful accommodation. I know in schools the word accommodation sometimes is a good thing. In anxiety treatment, sometimes accommodating too much, maybe robbing kids from the opportunity to try something new. So how can we help parents to know, when is it a helpful time for me to step in, and when do I have to take a step back? And why does that bring up so much anxiety, even as a parent, knowing how difficult that is when you just want to relieve someone's distress? When is it important to give them an opportunity to take a step on their own? And how do you navigate that? And families need the support as well. We have even 1-week intensive treatment camps for kids with selective mutism, kids who may not speak in the context of other adults. And it's not because they're not knowing the language, but it's more that they may be very frightened of the idea of hearing their own voice, of talking to another person. So we do this in a way that feels very natural, and they're in a group with people who are their own age and doing fun activities at the same time, learning some therapeutic skills. So this is just a snapshot, as well as services for the community. Again, how do we do a whole school approach? Maybe it is training educators on anxiety-reducing strategies they can use in the classroom. Training and helping kids to understand how to reduce those feelings as well. And I'm very grateful to have worked with, I see a number of people even in the audience who have been a part of some of the projects that BU Wheelock faculty, as well as some of us at Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, have collaborated on together. So some of the techniques that we may use to help middle schoolers, one is overall we want to try to reduce the anxiety response and try to help kids to better understand what is it, why does my heart race fast, why do I feel jittery, how do I reduce the fear response. But also it's increasing the positive activities and relationships that will reinforce strengths, decreasing avoidance. Most of the time, avoidance only makes fears grow larger, so we're trying to help kids to decrease avoidance. I had an amazing graduate student who even developed a treatment during the time where it was important to be able to get your different vaccines, and she developed an online treatment to help kids with an injection fear, and it worked amazingly. And this was, again, thinking about the approaches we have, how do we solve maybe a public health issue, and when fear is getting in the way, how can you get over that? So this is where some research as well as clinical work can be really effective. And in fact, another example of that is right now, if you had a teen or one that anyone from 12 to 18 who was suffering from anxiety, they could come in for a 1-week treatment, an intensive treatment approach where there's nothing really experimental about the treatment, but kids can be treated free of charge. It's part of a research study, and my colleague is examining whether being in person versus doing a treatment online, so where you're on Zoom, for example, are both of those pretty comparable in the kinds of results. And our online approaches happened very quickly during COVID without necessarily looking at, hey, for whom might this be better than an online approach, and is it always the best to have in-person therapies? So these are definitely ways that we will help to improve kids' help. And again, psychoeducation is one part of the treatment. Doesn't matter what type of anxiety problem you may come into for our center, but again, understanding better, picture understanding the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but actually doing it in a way that's very middle school friendly, if we had middle schoolers in there. And understanding why exactly those symptoms are actually not really attacking you and how you actually very much can be in control. So we do this by breaking down anxiety into thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, also examining treatments that might help you to evaluate better some of the thoughts that may be feeding anxiety, some of the physical sensations, and why heart racing and sweating and dizziness are all actually your body's way of keeping you safe, not actually harming you at all. And how do we get better in control of that? As well as what are the behaviors that we may all do when we feel anxious. They could be subtle avoidance. It could be taking big swigs of water from a water bottle, things that actually you're kind of wanting to keep things down. But in fact, what we learn at the Center for Anxiety is it's not all about just calming techniques. In fact, in some ways, it's approaching and relearning, kind of retraining your brain to know that, in fact, you are going to be okay even with some small approaches, and eventually we'll feel really good about the other kinds of reinforcers that take over. So sometimes it is the case that kids come in and they're worrying about something, that red part of the pie, that's how much they're worrying about it. But when they really look at the chances of it happening, it's the tiniest, maybe it's even smaller than that, red dot. And so we are maybe helping kids to understand what does probability overestimation look like. However, when we consider the keynote, the wonderful keynote from this morning about the many things that are happening in the world that could cause real anxiety, that is not overestimation, we also think about a recent paper we wrote, and actually a talk we did at a conference, our team, is what to do when worries ring true. How do we help deal with realistic worries? And there are still tasks that have to happen. You have to get to school. There are things that have to happen even in the context of things that are difficult. And so our team is thinking about ways that we would take evidence-based treatments and make sure that they are actually tailorable to not only unrealistic worries, but also to realistic worries as well. So we encourage kids not to avoid fears, but in fact to ride the wave, almost like this wave of panic or anxiety. But what happens when you get past the height of it and you keep trying at it? Usually what we see is this habituation curve where eventually the anxiety does come down, and we do this in very small steps. So again, exposures and having families involved in helping is also, part of this, and navigating the parent-teen relationship one, like how do we also keep that relationship very strong even when kids are striving for independence. Sometimes, and I'm thinking about kids I'm working with right now, trying to develop good peer relationships also might require some additional scaffolding of skills, like social skills training. This may be, again, learning things like eye contact. How do I keep a conversation flowing in a way that feels good to someone else? Things that might help you to develop a really good friendship. As we know, these friendships are very critical at given times. Then also knowing how do we help youth cope with mental health problems in schools. So making sure schools and teachers understand all the ways that we may need to better identify kids who are anxious, because the anxious ones oftentimes are more quiet. They may not be causing disruptions in class, but they're secretly or quietly maybe suffering from some distress. So first of all, educating educators on how do we notice and identify anxiety. And I just want to acknowledge also the work of many colleagues, both teams, Dr. Green's team, as well as our team at the Center for Anxiety, have worked together to develop trainings for either early childhood educators in this case, trying to help young teachers of very young children, as well as our team has put together even online approaches in a creative way. I know that looks like a surf shack, but in fact, it's a little gamey, but kids can go in and every single item they click on leads to a different lesson in understanding how to manage panic disorder. And this is something that we did in collaboration with public schools in Massachusetts. So that's another exciting way that we may think about what are the tools we have and how do we expand access to care. And we know also developing caregiver support is important as well. We've had a number of examples of our collaborations and why they're important, understanding how do we help caregivers as they are helping kids to face the things that they're afraid of. Our team has also worked with Boston Medical Center and BU School of Medicine in a study that just finished, and results are about to come out. And this is comparing online approaches where this is led by the patient, as well as in-person approaches for anxiety treatment. And that is another ongoing study as well. As well as, again, intensive treatments, ways that we're varying the dose of treatment, because maybe if you're on a school break and you have 1 week, you could feel like you could get some relief. That would be better relief than not doing something. So we want, again, to make our treatments as accessible as possible. And I'll close today with, again, taking all of the talks that we heard today into account together, and I think it is by working together and with these different angles, the public health perspective, an individual therapy perspective, the school perspective, again, begin building some of these community partnerships, and so many of them exist excitedly right here at BU that we've developed. We can develop these novel prevention and intervention formats to increase families' access to care, and also help middle schoolers develop good strategies for decreasing stress and anxiety, as well as the other part of it, which is enhancing overall well-being. So thank you very much.
We're out of time, so we're going to end here, but our panel will stay around if you want to come up and say hello or have any questions. And if you exit through these doors, lunch will be right there for you. Thank you so much for coming today and being part of this presentation.
Hello. We are about to start the lunchtime keynote. Is this working? Good almost afternoon. We are about to start the lunchtime keynote. I am so excited about that. But before we do, I kind of want to give a shout out to whoever, I think it's Mary Ellen Medayo, who has constructed this amazing playlist for us. And I want to know who else in this room might have been singing along to 8675309. Anyone? Yeah? Okay, good. A couple people might be close to my age. Welcome back. Wow. Those morning sessions, terrific. I'm really excited. One of the best parts of being dean is supporting our stellar faculty, and we really do have amazing faculty here at BU Wheelock. And I'm really excited to introduce to you this afternoon two of them for our afternoon keynote. One, those of you who were with us last night will have met briefly. Dr. Tina Durand is clinical associate professor here in BU Wheelock and is a developmental psychologist with a background in community-based programming. Her research and teaching address critically conscious pedagogy and school contextual factors that promote student success in middle school. She's also the author of a recently released book titled Making the Case for Race in Middle School, and I really encourage you to run out and get it if you don't already have it. Equally amazing, Dr. Michael Medina is an assistant professor and director of the Applied Human Development Program here at BU Wheelock. As a Latino first-generation college graduate, Dr. Medina is interested in the systems and contexts that support student success. You can see a theme here. His research examines the benefits of ethnic racial identity development and diversity across social contexts. They're both going to share a little bit about their work, and then we're going to open it up for some audience Q&A. And so I'm really excited about this piece that is to come. And so start thinking about your questions if you haven't already, because they are going to be ready for them. So please join me in welcoming Drs. Durand and Medina.
Thank you, Dean Bishop. It is lovely to be here and see so many of you, enjoying your lunch, like my students are here. They know food and community go together for me, so love to see you here. So together with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Michael Medina, it's a privilege to be able to speak with you all today. Teachers, students, administrators, counselors, alum, BU Wheelock community and beyond. And it's going to be about something we all care really deeply about, the education, support, and affirmation of early adolescence in classrooms and in schools. Our topic today, critical racial consciousness among middle school students, is most